The avoidant is unraveling. Every psychological mechanism they've relied on to maintain control is failing catastrophically because you've done the one thing they never prepared for. You've stopped acknowledging their existence. You're not angry, you're not hurt, you're not pursuing, you're not even watching from a distance. You've genuinely disengaged, and the complete absence of your attention is destroying them in ways active conflict never could. The avoidant built their entire relational architecture on the assumption that they would always be the one controlling distance, the one deciding when contact happened, the one with the power to engage or withdraw at will. But you've taken that power and demolished it through pure indifference. They're screaming into a void that doesn't echo back, and the silence is annihilating them. What makes this psychological torture for the avoidant is that all their coping strategies are designed for managing intimacy that's present, not absence that's absolute. They know how to handle someone who wants too much from them. They create distance. They know how to manage someone who's emotional. They become logical. They know how to deal with pursuit. They withdraw. But they have zero tools for handling someone who has removed them from consideration entirely. Your ignoring them isn't a move in the relationship game they're familiar with. It's you leaving the game completely, and they're still standing on the board alone, unable to comprehend that the game is over. The avoidant is experiencing a complete psychological crisis because your disregard is attacking the core of their identity. They've always been the person who doesn't need anyone, who can walk away easily, who remains unbothered and untouched. But they constructed this identity in environments where people consistently reinforced their importance through pursuit. Your ignoring them reveals a devastating truth. Their supposed independence was actually dependence on being desired. Their strength was actually reliance on being wanted. Their power was actually borrowed from people who gave them power by caring. Without your attention, without your energy directed toward them, they're discovering they're not the self-sufficient fortress they believed themselves to be. They're a house of cards, and you removing your support has caused complete structural collapse. The narcissistic wound of irrelevance. The avoidant is confronting their own irrelevance, and it's delivering a narcissistic wound so deep, it's threatening their entire sense of self. They've always mattered to you, even when they were distant, even when they were cold, even when they treated you poorly, they mattered. Your pursuit proved their significance. Your patience demonstrated their value. Your continued effort affirmed that they were worth fighting for. But your ignoring them has stripped away all that affirmation. You're communicating through your absence that they don't matter enough to engage with, not even to be angry at, not even to get closure from. You've rendered them irrelevant, and irrelevance is the avoidant's deepest fear beneath all their defended independence. This wound manifests as obsessive questioning about their value. If you can ignore them this completely, were they ever important to you at all? Did the relationship mean anything? Or were you just passing time until something better came along? Were their fears correct all along that they're fundamentally unlovable and people only stay until they wise up? The avoidant's internal narrative is collapsing into self-doubt they've spent their life avoiding. They've always protected themselves by being the one who cares less, ensuring they could never be devastated by someone not caring about them. But your ignoring them has circumvented that protection entirely by showing them they do care, desperately, and the person they care about doesn't care back. The narcissistic wound is particularly agonizing because it forces the avoidant to see themselves through what they imagine is your perspective. Not worth the effort, not interesting enough to maintain attention, easily dismissed and forgotten. The avoidant has always feared being seen this way, which is why they struck first by being dismissive themselves. But you've flipped the script entirely. You're the one who found them unworthy of continued investment. You're the one who decided they weren't worth the energy. You're the one who can easily move forward while they're stuck obsessing over why you found them so easy to ignore. The collapse of their control mechanisms. The avoidant's entire psychological system is built on control through distance. When intimacy becomes threatening, they create space. When vulnerability feels dangerous, they withdraw. When someone wants more than they can give, they pull back until the pressure eases. This system has worked flawlessly throughout their life because it relied on other people continuing to pursue, continuing to close the gaps the avoidant created, continuing to maintain the connection despite the avoidant's withdrawal. But your ignoring them has destroyed this system completely because there's no gap to create when you've already created infinite distance. The collapse of their control mechanisms is leaving the avoidant in a state of complete psychological chaos. They're trying to use their usual strategies and discovering they don't work. They want to withdraw to create mystery and desire, but you're not paying attention to their absence. They want to reach out minimally to test if you'll respond enthusiastically, but you're not responding at all, or responding with such disinterest that their strategy backfires. They want to make you chase them, but you're not chasing. Every tool in their psychological toolkit is useless, and without those tools, they're drowning in anxiety they have no way to manage. The avoidant is discovering that control through distance only works when someone is trying to get close. Your ignoring them means there's no one to control, no dynamic to manage, no intimacy to regulate. They're shadowboxing, fighting an opponent who isn't in the ring, trying to deploy strategies in a battle that isn't happening because you've already left the battlefield entirely. The realization that their entire approach to relationships is completely ineffective when someone genuinely doesn't care is shattering their confidence in their ability to navigate relational dynamics. This collapse is also forcing the avoidant to confront how much of their identity was built on being able to control outcomes through withdrawal. They saw themselves as powerful, as the one who determined the terms of relationships, as someone who could always protect themselves by creating distance. But your ignoring them reveals that power was an illusion, maintained only by people who cooperated by pursuing. Real power is walking away completely, which is what you've done. And facing someone with real power, while their own power is revealed as fake, is creating an identity crisis the avoidant has no framework for processing. The desperate need for any response. The avoidant is experiencing something completely foreign to their usual psychology. Desperate need for any kind of response from you, even negative response. They would prefer your anger to your indifference. They would welcome your hurt over your absence. They would rather have you yelling at them than ignoring them, because any engagement at all would prove they still matter to you. But you're giving them nothing, and the nothing is more painful than any emotional reaction could be. This desperate need is manifesting in behavior the avoidant would have found pathetic in others. They're considering reaching out with transparent excuses. They're thinking about creating situations where you'd have to acknowledge them. They're obsessing over what they could say or do to provoke any response. They're lowering themselves to strategies they've always judged as weak or needy because the alternative, continued irrelevance in your life, is unbearable. The avoidant is discovering that being ignored is worse than any emotional conflict. That absence of attention is more painful than presence of anger. That indifference cuts deeper than hurt. The desperate need also includes bargaining, where the avoidant is willing to accept crumbs of attention they would have rejected before. They would take a cold response over no response. They would accept minimal acknowledgement over complete absence. They would welcome even your anger or criticism if it meant they registered in your consciousness at all. The standards they held so rigidly before, the way they could casually dismiss people who didn't meet their specific criteria, all of that has dissolved in the face of your ignoring them. They're learning that when you're being ignored by someone who matters, you'll take any form of recognition just to confirm you exist to them. The avoidant is also desperate for any information about what you're thinking or feeling. When you were engaged with them, even in conflict, they had data. They knew you cared because you were emotionally invested in what happened between you. But your ignoring them has created a complete information blackout. They don't know if you think about them at all. They don't know if you're hurt or healed or completely indifferent. They don't know if you've moved on or if you're just protecting yourself. The absence of information is torture because their mind fills the void with the worst interpretations, all of which center on their own worthlessness and your justified departure. The envy of your apparent peace. The avoidant is consumed with envy of what appears to be your peace, your ability to move forward, your capacity to ignore them completely. They're projecting onto you a serenity they absolutely don't feel themselves, imagining you unbothered and thriving while they're falling apart. Whether or not you're actually at peace is irrelevant. What matters is that you appear to be, and that appearance is driving the avoidant insane with jealousy and inadequacy. This envy is particularly painful because the avoidant has always been the one who appeared unbothered. They were the ones who could walk away seemingly unaffected. They were the ones who maintained composure while others fell apart. They were the ones who seemed to have easy access to emotional distance and detachment. But you've taken that position from them entirely. You're the one who seems fine. You're the one who can apparently move forward without looking back. You're the one demonstrating that this connection is survivable, even forgettable. And the role reversal is psychologically devastating. The avoidant is also envious of what they perceive as your ability to not care. They're trapped in obsessive thoughts about you, unable to stop analyzing what happened and why you're ignoring them. But you appear to have moved on effortlessly, as if they were just a chapter that closed naturally rather than a person who still occupies any space in your mind. The avoidant is learning a brutal lesson. They were never actually good at not caring. They were good at looking like they didn't care while being protected by others who cared desperately. But when faced with someone who genuinely doesn't seem to care about them, they're revealed as completely incapable of the indifference they performed for years. The envy extends to jealousy about who or what might be occupying your attention now. If you're not thinking about them, what are you thinking about? If you're not emotionally invested in them, where is your emotional investment going? The thought that you might be directing your energy, your care, your attention toward literally anything or anyone else while they're getting nothing creates a jealousy so intense it borders on rage. But rage requires an object, and you're not available to receive their rage, which loops them back into the original problem. You're ignoring them, and there's nothing they can do about it. The shattering of their defensive superiority. The avoidant has always maintained psychological safety through defensive superiority. They position themselves as less needy than others, less emotional, less affected by relationship dynamics. They look down on people who got attached and hurt, viewing that vulnerability as weakness they'd transcended. They prided themselves on being above the messy emotional entanglements that trapped other people. But your ignoring them has completely shattered this defensive superiority because they're discovering they're exactly as needy, exactly as emotional, exactly as vulnerable as everyone they've ever judged. The shattering of superiority manifests as shame so intense the avoidant can barely tolerate it. They're experiencing all the feelings they've mocked in others, the obsessive thinking, the desperate desire for contact, the pain of being dismissed, the anxiety of uncertainty. They're becoming the clingy, needy person they've always feared becoming, and the self-disgust is overwhelming. Every thought they have about you, every moment they spend hoping you'll reach out, every fantasy they construct about reconnection, all of it proves they're not the emotionally evolved person they believed themselves to be. The defensive superiority was also built on believing they were more psychologically sophisticated than others. They understood attachment theory. They knew their patterns. They could articulate their needs. They thought this awareness made them better equipped to handle relationships than people who operated unconsciously. But your ignoring them is revealing that intellectual understanding without emotional integration is worthless. They can narrate their feelings with impressive vocabulary while being completely controlled by those feelings. They can explain their patterns while being trapped in those patterns. The sophistication they prided themselves on is revealed as surface-level performance that crumbles the moment someone treats them the way they've treated countless others. The avoidant is also confronting the collapse of their belief that they were the prize to be won. They've moved through relationships feeling like they were doing people a favor by giving them attention, like their presence was a gift others should be grateful for. But your ignoring them demonstrates you don't view them as a prize at all. You view them, if you view them at all, as someone not worth the cost of continued engagement. The reversal from prize to burden in their own perception is ego-shattering, the realization that indifference is final. The avoidant is slowly, painfully realizing that indifference is more final than anger, more absolute than hurt, more permanent than conflict. When people were angry with them in the past, the avoidant knew the anger proved they still mattered. When people expressed hurt, the avoidant understood the hurt meant they were still emotionally significant. When people fought with them, the avoidant recognized the fight as investment in the relationship. But your indifference communicates something far more devastating. You've moved past the emotional investment entirely. This realization is hitting the avoidant in waves of increasing devastation. Anger can transform back into love. Hurt can heal into reconnection. Conflict can resolve into intimacy. But indifference doesn't transform. It just is. It's the emotional equivalent of death, the complete cessation of caring. The avoidant is understanding that you haven't just pulled away temporarily or created space to process. You've actually stopped caring in ways that can't be reversed by their sudden availability or belated efforts. The finality of indifference is more terrifying than any active rejection because rejection at least acknowledges importance. Indifference doesn't acknowledge anything. The avoidant is also realizing that indifference means they can't win you back through their usual strategies. They can't create mystery because you're not curious. They can't deploy scarcity because you're not interested in securing their availability. They can't use their understanding of psychology to manipulate a return because you're not engaged enough to be manipulated. Your indifference has made you completely immune to all the tactics that used to give the avoidant power in relationships. They're discovering that you can't seduce someone who isn't paying attention, can't intrigue someone who isn't interested, can't win back someone who has genuinely moved on. The finality is also teaching the avoidant about consequences in ways they've never learned before. They've always been able to leave and come back, to push people away and pull them close when they were ready, to disappear and reappear without real repercussions, but your indifference is a consequence they can't escape or undo. They pushed you away one too many times, took you for granted once too often, and now the door isn't just closed. It's disappeared entirely. The relationship isn't salvageable because there's no relationship. There's just them, obsessing over someone who has deleted them from consideration. The physical manifestation of being ignored. The psychological torture of being ignored is manifesting physically in ways the avoidant can't control or suppress. They're experiencing the somatic symptoms of abandonment anxiety, the constant tension in their body, the knot in their stomach that never releases, the pressure in their chest that feels like physical weight. These sensations are their nervous system responding to your absence as threat, activating stress responses that won't turn off because the threat, your continued indifference, never resolves. The avoidant is also experiencing disrupted sleep patterns that leave them exhausted and even more emotionally vulnerable. They lie awake replaying every interaction with you, analyzing what they did wrong, constructing scenarios where they could fix things. When they do sleep, they dream about you, waking up disoriented and having to re-experience the loss each morning. The lack of rest compounds their psychological distress, creating a cycle where their physical depletion makes emotional regulation impossible, which increases their obsession with you, which prevents rest. The physical manifestation includes loss of appetite or stress eating, depending on the avoidant's particular coping style. Food loses appeal because their stomach is in constant knots, or food becomes the only comfort in a life that feels devoid of pleasure. They notice their hands shaking when they think about reaching out to you. They experience waves of nausea when they imagine you with someone else. Their body is expressing the emotional pain their mind keeps trying to intellectualize away, and the disconnect between their physical distress and their attempts to minimize that distress is creating additional psychological strain. The avoidant is also noticing how depleted they feel generally. Everything requires more effort than it used to. Work is harder. Social interaction is exhausting. Basic self-care feels overwhelming. They're running on empty because so much of their energy is consumed by obsessing over you and why you're ignoring them. The physical depletion is making them more desperate, more irrational, more willing to do things they would have considered beneath them before. They're discovering that being ignored creates a full-body experience of rejection that can't be controlled through mental discipline or emotional suppression. The comparison to how they treated you. The most psychologically brutal aspect of being ignored is the belated recognition of what you must have felt during all the times the avoidant ignored you. They're experiencing firsthand the confusion, the hurt, the self-doubt, the anxiety of not knowing where you stand. They're living the uncertainty they created for you repeatedly. They're feeling the pain of being dismissed, and the empathy that comes from direct experience is hitting them with devastating force. This comparison is forcing the avoidant to see their past behavior with clarity they've never had. Every time they saw your message and didn't respond, you felt what they're feeling now. Every time they went days without contact, you experienced what they're experiencing now. Every time they were cold after you'd been warm, you suffered what they're suffering now. The avoidant is developing empathy through the worst possible teacher, direct experience of the pain they inflicted. and the empathy is compounded by the awareness that they have no right to the sympathy they desperately want, because they never showed you that sympathy when you needed it. The comparison also includes the realization that you tolerated their ignoring for far longer than they're able to tolerate yours. You gave them chance after chance. You continued reaching out despite being ignored repeatedly. You maintained hope and patience while they casually dismissed your efforts. But they're falling apart after just days or weeks of you ignoring them. They lack the emotional resilience you demonstrated consistently, and recognizing this makes them feel weak and ashamed. They're confronting the reality that you were actually the stronger one all along, the one capable of sustaining effort despite not receiving it in return, while they're collapsing almost immediately when faced with the same treatment. The avoidant is also comparing their current desperation to your past pursuit and recognizing the difference. You pursued from a place of hope and care. You reached out because you valued the connection and wanted it to work. But they're pursuing now from a place of ego injury and loss of control. They want you back not necessarily because they've learned to value you properly, but because you ignoring them has triggered every wound they've tried to protect. The motivations are completely different, and the avoidant knows it, which adds another layer of shame to their current state. The fundamental terror of invisibility. Beneath all the other psychological distress is a fundamental terror the avoidant has spent their life avoiding. The terror of being invisible, of not mattering, of being insignificant in someone else's life. The avoidant has always protected against this terror by being the one who makes others feel invisible. They controlled who got their attention and when, maintaining power through their ability to grant or withhold recognition. But you ignoring them has flipped this entirely. Now they're the ones who are invisible to you, and the experience is activating primal fears about their fundamental unworthiness. This terror connects to the avoidant's core wound. Somewhere in their history, probably childhood, they learned that their emotional needs didn't matter, that expressing those needs led to disappointment or rejection, that they were safest when they needed nothing from anyone. They built elaborate defenses around this wound, creating an identity of someone who doesn't need recognition or validation. But your ignoring them is revealing that the need never went away. It just went underground. And now it's surfacing with volcanic force, proving that beneath all their defended independence is a wounded person who desperately wants to be seen and valued. The terror of invisibility is also triggering existential questions about the avoidant's place in the world. If you can ignore them this completely, if they can be this irrelevant to someone who once cared about them, what does that say about their significance? Are they important to anyone? Does their presence or absence matter? The questions spiral into darker territory, attacking their sense of having meaningful impact on the world. The avoidant is discovering that being ignored doesn't just hurt emotionally, it threatens their sense of existing meaningfully at all. The fork in the road. The avoidant stands at a critical juncture, and the path they choose will determine whether your ignoring them becomes catalyst for growth or further retreat into defended patterns. They can use this experience as the wake-up call they've needed, the one that finally penetrates their defenses enough to motivate real change. They can seek therapy, do the deep work of addressing their attachment wounds, develop capacity for vulnerability and sustained intimacy. They can transform the pain of being ignored into wisdom about how their behavior affected you and countless others before you. Or they can retreat further into their defensive patterns, using your ignoring them as confirmation that relationships are dangerous, that caring about people leads to pain, that their original instinct to keep everyone at distance was correct. They can harden rather than soften, building even higher walls, becoming even more defended. They can carry the experience as evidence that vulnerability is weakness, and that their inability to show up properly was protective wisdom, rather than fearful limitation. The direction they go depends on factors you can't control and shouldn't worry about. Your job was to recognize that continuing to pursue someone who couldn't show up for you was betraying yourself, and you did that job by choosing to ignore them. Their job is to decide what they do with the consequences of their behavior. Some avoidants will use the pain as motivation for transformation. Most will eventually minimize it, reconstruct their defensive narratives, and continue their patterns with someone new. But either way, they will never forget that you were the one who stopped pursuing, the one who found them ignorable, the one who taught them that their strategy of controlling relationships through distance only works when someone cooperates by chasing them. They can't handle that you're ignoring them because you're ignoring them has destroyed every psychological mechanism they use to feel safe in relationships. You've taken their power, shattered their identity, forced them to feel everything they've spent their life avoiding. And whether that destruction leads to reconstruction as a more whole person or just to more elaborate defenses depends entirely on choices they make in the rubble of what your absence has demolished.